Hello and welcome to the Center for the National Interest. I'm Christian Whiten, a senior fellow at the center and your moderator for today's discussion about Japan and U.S. foreign policy. The recent assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe shocked Japan and its allies, but also highlighted the degree to which Japan's position in the region and the world has changed since Abe's first premiership began in 2006. Upper house parliamentary elections in the wake of the assassination have given the ruling party a wide margin and the chance to revise Japan's pacifist constitution. Furthermore, there is much attention to how the war in Ukraine will change Europe, but the economic and military impact of the war is also changing Asia. What's next for the political military evolution of Japan, and what role will Japan play in the competition with China? We're pleased to be joined today by Nabe Watanabe and Stephen Yates to discuss these matters. Nabe is a senior fellow at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Tokyo. He joined the organization in 2016 after serving as a senior fellow and a director of foreign and security policy research at the Tokyo Foundation. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Mitsui Global Strategic Studies Institute and a visiting research scholar at CSIS. He remains an adjunct fellow there today. Steve is the chair of the new China Policy Initiative at the America First Policy Institute. He previously served as president of Radio Free Asia and in the White House as a deputy national security advisor to the vice president from 2001 through 2005. Before that, Steve was a senior policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation and an analyst at the National Security Agency. Nabe and Steve are going to give some brief opening remarks, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during their remarks or afterward by clicking on the Q&A button. With that, come on in, Nabe, with your opening remarks. And thanks for being here at, I guess, 10 p.m. Tokyo time.
Thanks, Christian. I think it's Nabe. I'm Nabe Watanabe. I'm now from Tokyo, so it's no, but I visited Washington, D.C. last week, and I really appreciate the very warm words to the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe whenever I met in the United States. And it's not just, the former ramen, but many experts, actually, I met only security and foreign policy experts. They really counted what former Prime Minister Abe contributed to the shaping the Japan's policy, and also not only Japan's policy somehow affected to the U.S. policy that's the FOIP, free and open in the Pacific policy. I think many people know that prototype it was proposed by the Mr. Abe, and also somehow such idea is somehow the shared with not only America but other country like Australia or the ASEAN and even some European countries share the very similar elements. So we missed Abe. That's clearly. And by the way, I personally have known Mr. Abe for a long time, and I missed him personally. So I'd like to touch a little bit this. The Christian introduced me. I served a visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic International Studies, and I'd like to add also, I became a permanent employee and working at the senior CSIS as a senior fellow. At that time, before Abe became a prime minister, we tried to invite him to speak at the CSIS. And Abe's position was a Secretary General of the Liberal Democratic Party. That's high-ranking position. Unfortunately, at the time, Prime Minister Abe didn't choose the CSIS. Instead, he spoke at the AEI, another think tank. But instead, Abe offered a more intensive off-the-record exchange with the CSIS experts. And also, personally, he apologized to me for not to choose the CSIS. But Prime Minister Abe remember, and he chose a speech as a Prime Minister at the CSIS. So nice guy, seriously. He's a warm guy. And also, beyond the personal, I'd like to point out that I've been in think tanks in the US and Japan for a long time, and made a lot of policy recommendation to Japan. And many policy recommendations in the first year of my life was not realized or sometimes ignored by the Japanese government. Many piled up homework. For example, Japan should exercise the right of collective defense. Japan should create a National Security Council function like the United States. And Japan should have a national security strategy document as the US has. And Japan should revise the export control, or especially the former one is a complete ban on the export of weapons, should be modified to the more flexibility for giving capacity building ability to the neighbor countries. That big task never realized until 2013 and 14. That's clearly the Abe administration. You know, believe it or not, Abe administration cleared all documents, all the piled up homework, and gave Japan to be back in the international stage. So no wonder, no wonder the Abe called Japan is back speech at the CSIS. Of course, still Japan has a lot of homework. The reason is simply the historical background. Japan and Germany was the nation who were defeated in the World War II. So in the World War II world, Japan and Germany didn't join fully to the the international order creation, so-called P5 of United Nations. However, you know what? Such a old world order is now changing. The reason is P5 includes China and Russia. And now P5 is very polarized by the two countries who has a veto and created more trouble and conflict. So now, a very interesting move in Europe. Germany especially now vow to spend 2% of GDP as a defense budget after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And now Japan's LDP is somehow recommending targeting to the spending 2% of GDP as a defense budget. Of course, not immediately, but in the some midterm, like a five years. And if you can calculate, that's probably the very big help to the international stage. For example, the US defense budget in 2022 is $766 billion. And the Chinese budget is now $230 billion. So China's budget is skyrocketing. And if Germany spend 2%, that's almost 110 billion. If Japan spend the 2%, almost the same amount, 110 billion. Add 220 to the US. Probably, of course, just comparison of a defense budget doesn't make sense. Of course, need the capability, but it's something new world. I'm not saying I'm not professing the Japan and Germany is changing the new world, but at least Japan and Germany didn't spend their national wealth to the free national defense or international peace activity. So new world, Japan has a potential to play new role. Of course, that's just started. By the way, former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo really expected Japan such as playing a fair burden over international security. And he predicted and he set up some the roadmap for the Japan is gradually stepping up. So again, I lamented Shinzo Abe and appreciated the US support to the alliance and the Shinzo Abe. I'll stop. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Nabe, for those introductory remarks. It's very interesting. I didn't know Japan was entertaining going to 2%. You know, for so long, it spent about 1% of GDP, the informal guideline, or 1.1% under some of those recent increases. So that would be a big game changer in the Pacific. Steve, can you please give your opening remarks?
Well, thank you very much, Christian and Nabe. It's wonderful to join good friends in a conversation about a meaningful topic and allow the world to join in. It's, I think, very, very worthwhile to reflect, as Nabe did, about Shinzo Abe, the man, the politician, the leader, and the arc of his leadership over a long period of time. A lot of us get caught in news cycles and think in short-term election cycles. And even though Shinzo Abe, as Nabe noted when he first talked to him, was a secretary general of a political party, obviously very focused on politics and those cycles, he was rare in that he thought in longer terms than just those immediate needs. The elections were a means to an end, not an end of themselves. And not just an end for his country, but in shaping the neighborhood in which Japan resides and in shaping some elements of the world order, as a lot of experts refer to it. I can think of almost no other ally of the United States that has had as big and positive an impact on American foreign policy over the last generation than has Japan. And I think a lot of that has to do with the commitment of Japanese leaders to alliance maintenance. I remember at some point along the way, Shinzo Abe was a part of a conversation about U.S.-Japan relations. It might have been a private conversation in D.C. or it could have been in Japan. I don't remember. But he talked about this concept of constant gardening, that the need to maintain an alliance, you sort of have to add some fertilizer, you have to pull some weeds, and you need there to be some sunshine. You can draw your own analogies to what that means, but I think it comes down to a simple four-letter word of work. In addition to being a politician and a prominent leader, Shinzo Abe was committed to that work, meeting with some people that were elected and powerful and influential, but also meeting with some people that were working within the various policy community elements. So I think that is just such a rare quality that it's worth noting, and perhaps something we could be pressing other aspiring and current leaders to live up to, that kind of a standard. I think when you look at the arc that Japan took during Shinzo Abe's time, it's one that to a lot of us in America seems common sense. So there was a time he referred to it as a normal nation project. And most people would think, well, of course, Japan should be a normal nation. It is a normal nation. What do you mean by that? And I think while political actors in Asia are very aware of the political warfare that surrounds World War II, the pressure for perpetual apologies, and other kinds of political efforts in the United States and other parts of the world, we are a bit removed from that currency now. I think especially in the post-COVID world, it's a bit much for a government like the Chinese Communist Party to demand apologies and accountability for mass death and economic injury when they themselves have done far more damage to the world than you can really even attribute to what happened in World War II to a lot of the world. Now, parts of Asia, very different story, but in terms of the United States, Europe, and a lot of other parts of the world, COVID has had a profound negative cost economically, health, in terms of distraction. So I think we definitely live in a different kind of world, and leaders should take stock about where we go from here and with which allies. And in my view, not all allies are equal, and not all alliances are equally healthy. We face, I think, a stark contrast in US-Japan relations relative to the NATO alliance, where we have, in many respects, the members of NATO are not contributing a fair share to what the needs are for the Ukrainian people who have suffered an invasion by a neighboring Russia. Nabe pointed to the United Nations and the international community failing to deter and appropriately address this conflict through the United Nations system. Of course, the greatest farce in that was the emergency meeting of the Security Council about the invasion was chaired by Russia itself. And so in a world where institutions that a lot of experts turn to address problems, I think there have to be big question marks in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And those questions apply to Asia and other parts of the world as much as they do to Europe. The questions of fair sharing of responsibility, treasure, risk, burden, however you want to define it within an alliance is a reasonable question. In the wake of Abe's tragic assassination, it was very clear in looking over the record of his activities that he felt that it was very important for Japan's own survival to make sure that Japan was doing everything it could, of course, with its national interest first, but everything it could to keep Americans committed to that alliance. And that in doing so, there had to be a significant Japanese contribution to security in Asia and other parts of the world. Because of the post-World War II Constitution and the restrictions imposed by that, something I think there should be now wider discussion about ending and turning a page toward and making Japan a more normal nation. But even within that birdcage of restrictions, Japan gave generously to humanitarian and commercial assistance in many parts of Asia. And so if you take the contrast of what the investments are in defense budgets, what the investments are in the viability of democracy, commercial development, humanitarian needs, Japan has hit well above its weight in many respects across broader Asia that most people would see as the primary purview of the US-Japan alliance. And NATO and the EU, I think, have an unhappy comparison of not using the wealth and treasure that they have to adequately provide for the security of other Europeans and to provide for the humanitarian assistance. And so I think courtesy of Shinzo Abe's leadership, but also the millions of Japanese people who supported that transformation and hopefully continue to support that today, we have a much healthier US-Japan alliance and a much better foundation in Asia to build upon to actually deter Chinese Communist Party aggression and maybe even build the foundation for an alternative future that is better for that region, better for humanity, and might actually avoid the need for US military intervention. That's the hope. Of course, we have to work very, very hard, and the Chinese Communist Party spends every single day trying to divide the alliance, undermine faith in these capabilities, and to seek its advantages with aggressive politics, economics, and military means. But thanks to Abe and the people of Japan, I think we're in a better place. And it's not just a Pollyannish kind of exaggeration because we're talking with our good friend Nabe from Japan. I think it has the added virtue of being true. And I think too few Americans appreciate that.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve. We always love it when things are coincidentally true. And I enjoyed your remarks about, in particularly gardening and sort of the upkeep that alliances need. So we'll circle back to that in a second. But you're going to jump in with the question. And for our viewers, if you have a question, please click the Q&A button and put it in as that coffee kicks in, that second cup of coffee for those of you who are in Washington and New York, or maybe that glass of scotch for those of you watching in Tokyo. Anything that comes to your mind, please send it our way. First question is about something that's near and dear to a number of people at the Center for the National Interests, and it deals with possible alliance between Russia and China, or short of an alliance, cooperation. This is something that's been discussed and worried about. Henry Kissinger raised it as far back, I believe, as the 1980s. But parts of it seem to be coming a little bit true. Nikkei Asia reported last week that, quote, Chinese and Russian military activity around Japan increased 2.5 times in the 4 months following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, sparking alarm in Tokyo about a potential escalation, also some alarm in Washington. Some of the escalated activities were Chinese and Russian displays of force near the Senkakus, military aircraft off the coast of Hokkaido. Those are Russian military aircraft and Chinese and Russian naval vessels circumnavigating Japan, which apparently is a little bit rare. Nabe, what do you make of this? Do you think there is an elevated risk of Chinese-Russian cooperation to the detriment of Japan and the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a little bit mixed signal from Russia and China. Honestly, we still don't know how seriously Russia and China are trying to cooperate together, especially in the Asia Pacific area, because somehow potentially China and Russia has the rivalry too. But now both sides realize China needs Russia, Russia needs China for the somehow long-term competition with the United States and Europe. So that's probably the one message sending at least Japan. If you are taking US or European side, you may have a big trouble to face a more formidable enemy. That's probably Steve already said that both countries try to somehow defect the allied relation between the US and the US ally. And however, China already increasing a big threatening to so often, so frequent the scrambling to the near Japan's air zone, and Russia has been very quiet after the end of Cold War. But Russia itself increased a lot of patrolling surrounding Japan. So somehow Japan is accustomed to their increase to the more military operation surrounding Japan. That's one of the reasons why the former Prime Minister Abe got some strong support from the domestically to increase Japan's own defense capability. So again, now China and Russia is showing they're about to cooperate. That's not so good things. So, but one positive factor is such kind of a move would make Japan's more strong agreement to increase Japan's own defense and strengthening allied the cooperation with the United States. So still we don't know the intention of the result, but we are closely watching.
Well, Steve, picking up on that, you had, of course, the Soviet Union come in against Japan at the very end of World War II, basically just in time to grab what's today North Korea and some islands in northern Japan. Prior to that, when Russia and Japan fought, it didn't come out well for the Russians. I'm straining my history, but the Russo-Japanese War around 1905, not a good outcome for Moscow. Do you think that this potential condominium, the idea that maybe Russia is being pushed towards China, is something that should be a major consideration in part of the alliance?
Well, I agree very much with the way you framed it initially, not in talking about China and Russia as an alliance, but in collaboration or cooperation, as I see that there, a 100-year-long pattern of different times when that condominium was drawing closer and pulling apart. The main thing, I think, for America and the free world to keep in close focus is that it is so much easier to frustrate and disrupt and to break things than it is to make enduring positive contributions. And so while the US and Japan and other allies work hard to build an ecosystem that is conducive to prosperity, development, peace, security, freedom, all the shared values that modern Japan and the United States have in common, it is much easier for Russia and China to from time to time collaborate in an aggressive military exercise, to challenge airspace and sea lines of communication, to exchange military materiel. And so it doesn't cost as much for them to do those things, and it can cost a lot for us to figure out how to respond and to keep our public's confidence high and feeling of security in an area where it should be. So they don't have to have a full-fledged alliance for it to be a problem. I think this transactional collaboration is damaging enough. And I do think that the recent rise in talk of that concept, whether it was Putin's visit to the Olympics, with at least the appearance of getting an agreement from China that he's going to proceed with invasion of Ukraine, and that in the wake of the sanctions that they might work together to make sure that energy and financial flows are not as wildly disruptive as they might have been. That definitely frustrates the tools that the free world has to try to impose punitive outcomes on non-status quo actors. So that has to be taken very seriously. But whether it's Japan, the United States, or really any sensible leader in the world, other than those who share a direct border with Moscow, we have to take much more seriously the comprehensive strategic challenge that the Communist Party of China presents than anything that Putin and Moscow can bring to the table. That the CCP, through its political warfare within our countries, manipulation of international organizations, the stealing of intellectual property, the co-optation of supply chains and key technologies, all of this has a much greater strategic impact than the Soviet Union could ever dreamed of, or that current Russia under Putin could ever dream of. And so it's very, very important that we maintain a long-term focus on where the challenge is and really who our true enemy or attacker might be. And that's the enemy of the Chinese people. The Chinese Communist Party is also the enemy of the free world in terms of the equities that we share and protect with our family, our friends, and our countries. So I look at Russia-China condominium as a legitimate near-term frustration and challenge, but it's really the key driver is Beijing under Xi Jinping, and how do we, I think, minimize the negative impact of his leadership and their aggressive activities now.
Nabe, picking up on what Steve said earlier about gardening and maintaining relations in an alliance, we have a question from Paul here at the Center for the National Interests. How has the current state of U.S. politics affected Tokyo's perception or assessment of Washington's attention to and reliability in pursuit of shared U.S.-Japanese interests in East Asia? I guess in other words, how we are in a turbulent period in U.S. politics. People are expecting a potential change in power coming this November in Congress, at least in one house. And, obviously, President Biden hosted Prime Minister Kishida in Washington, one of the relatively small number of foreign leaders who's been welcomed to the White House. But what do you think the perception is in Japan of the U.S. political situation right now? Nabe, I think you might be muted. Yeah.
That's very good question. I would like to stress Japan or the U.S.-Japan alliance are one of rare the common agreement between highly partisan the U.S. politics. So Japan somehow for example, the Prime Minister Abe, former Prime Minister Abe received a very warm comment from former President Trump, but at the same time also the current President the Biden. That's probably it's the common interest of both U.S. Republican and Democrats to challenge the competition with China. That's very clear. and somehow Japan enjoying the continuing the support of alliance. Well, and the same thing apply in Congress too. But at the same time, Japan is making an effort to try to show the alliance strength with both party, Republican and Democrats. In a historic pattern, to be honest, Japan prefer Republican than Democrats. One reason is Democrats tend to be the more having trade friction with Japan. And also, to be honest, the more Republican government presidents are elected. But considering such kind of effect, the Japanese policymakers and the politicians try to be somehow equal partnership with both Republican government and the Democrat government. By the way, Japan is a very unique one-party rule so far. Of course, the very short-term opposition party occupy the government. And Japan's really homework is a stable government change would be the required. But unfortunately, Japan didn't do that. But I tell you, I praise a lot to the contribution of Prime Minister Abe. But why? Because the failure of previous Democrat government was giving a lot of leverage to the second Abe administration to attain a lot of things. So this dynamics is somehow good. By the way, the China Russia condominium also giving a lot of leverage to the Japan's more realistic and pragmatic security policy. Current upper house election, national security issue is a very high attention from the voters. That's not usually happening. Economy is always, and the security issue is a kind of a taboo. But because of Russian invasion, Ukraine, and China's assertive action increasing, clearly Japanese voters are watching and clearly voting LDP. So I think Japanese constituency is getting more realistic and pragmatic, and they really wanted to very stable relation with the United States. So they try to be nice to both Republicans and Democrats.
Well, that makes good pragmatic realist sense. Steve, can I turn that question around? Your time at the White House and subsequently was a time of political turmoil. I mean, there was some degree of unity, of course, after 9/11, but also some very pointed debates and arguments throughout that decade over issues of national security. In the White House, did you get a lot of questions from either Japanese or other officials about U.S. politics? Is there always great concern about what's going on here? And then I guess the other side of that coin is, was stable LDP control in Japan seen as an asset from the White House?
Well, I think during that time, there was sort of this unusual experience because Japan had gone through seemingly a prime minister every year for a time. When Koizumi was elected, he ended up having an enduring period of sustained governance, and it allowed for the establishment of personal rapport between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Japan. That is a model that Abe sought to replicate in his second term to Japan's advantage. But it really, it was an echo of Prime Minister Nakasone and Ronald Reagan, but then Koizumi and Bush, and then later Abe, and for most of his tenure, Trump, that there was this enduring rule that allowed for some personal rapport between leaders. And I think a lot of people in politics and policy don't fully appreciate how much room that can actually give for policy getting done well between countries. Nabe pointed to, I think historically accurately, that Democrats had tended to be the ones that would push back on notions of protectionism in the US-Japan relationship. Of course, famously during the Trump administration, trade between the US and Japan was also something that received some pressure from the US administration. And because there had been a shifting of this coalition in the United States. And so I think if you look at the experience that I witnessed during the Bush administration and where things have been going now, the one constant is that within Japan, I think that if they can pull it off, they see some value in having an enduring period of leadership, and they value having a personal relationship with the major leaders of the United States. And again, like I described on other things, it wasn't an end of itself. It was in order to do some of this gardening, some of this reform, some of this long-term scene setting of the general trajectory of our countries, the broader Asian region, and maybe some things that were happening in the world. In the post 9/11 environment, there was that period of global and national unity that ended relatively briefly. And in the period after the invasion of Iraq, there was, as people might remember, some animated domestic politics and some things around the world where there were questions about our politics and policy. Some very derogatory names were hurled in the direction of the president of the United States. And we had very, very close elections. The 2004 election was a very narrow margin of victory for President Bush in his reelection. And so there were constant questions about, well, if the Democrats are going to come back into power, what kind of policy changes there would be. We did have questions from Japanese counterparts, but other allies and partners around the world about what one might think and what one might expect. But really, I think a lot of the world feels fated to whatever the voters of America give them, and they know that they really don't have a lot of choice. They have to make the best they can of whatever Congress and whatever White House they're presented with. And so they tended to treat us somewhat constructively, and they would hedge their bets in outreach to the other parties and watching the pendulum of American politics swing back and forth. The most meaningful tension in that, though, is do they feel like they can comfortably bet on some margin of where the US-Japan relationship can go over time, factoring in the vicissitudes of American politics. Mm-hmm. If American politics seem to get into the point where it breaks the ability to think beyond a 2-year to 4-year cycle, then I think that is difficult to the point of a crisis for Japanese policymakers. But even with the craziness of American politics and changes in the world from 2000 to now, I don't think that Japanese leaders have felt like they've been put in that position so far.
All right, thank you, Steve. Turning back to a very contemporary issue, this question comes from Nobuhide Matsumoto. I'll read it and then I'll add something, but Mr. Matsumoto is reading my mind because I had a question along these lines. The COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns in China caused blows to the Japanese economy. Current developments in Russo-Ukrainian war and what is happening in the Sakhalin gas project show that states could easily be subject to direct or indirect or intentional or unintentional blockades. Do you think Japan could become resilient enough in protecting the crisis time economy, and what could be the role of the U.S. in achieving this? This was on my mind because I read a story also in Nikkei Asia about Japan restarting reactors. Apparently, a number of nuclear reactors remain offline from the Fukushima incident so many years ago, even though they've been essentially certified as safe. And we are seeing huge changes in the world economy of energy, where Russian energy, frankly, is making its way to places like China, India, and everywhere except for the G7, basically at a discount. And I think the ramifications of this are hard to assess now, but they're going to be very, very significant financial security otherwise. So, Nabe, I guess just to simplify the question, is there an effort in Japan to become more energy independent?
All right. That's a very tough question for the Japan's future. And the Japan has been challenged by the energy security all the time. Japan started to exist. So especially the industrial nation energy is really indispensable for the maintaining the military, maintaining the industry, growing economy. And Japan has been heavily dependent on energy flow from the Middle East and the Gulf nation. And after experiencing several oil crises, especially the Gulf War or some so-called oil shock from the Arab nations decreasing export of oil. So Japan tried to hedge to the Russian natural gas. That's the portion somehow, maybe around the 10 or something percent of Japan's import from natural gas from Russia. Russia's gas is a hedge against the Middle East and the Gulf. And now Russia has a liability too. Well, Japan can go back to, again, 100% Middle East and Gulf. That's big question now. So as the Christian pointed out, nuclear somehow. So Japan experienced a very unfortunate tragedy of a Fukushima nuclear accident. But I think it took a time to maintain the people's confidence over the managing nuclear plants. But no, now Japan's government regulation to reopen the nuclear plants is so high. That's one of the reasons that so many nuclear plants are not yet operated. But that's good thing is, probably the more higher requirement is a more security guarantee. So, I believe Kishida government is doing a very right decision to opening up some more nuclear plants to survive a current situation. Anyway, Japan has been surviving in many energy crises in the past. And, real energy crisis, by the way, the 1920s, US military, US security sanction embargo against Japan, but that's Japan tried to invade China. So that was a very bad lesson. But somehow Japan realized Japan cannot survive without guaranteeing energy the flow to Japan. So that's somehow very difficult thing. But because of this, Japan is working hard. I think current crisis would be the somehow wake up call to Japan to consider how wisely Japan would survive.
All right, thank you, Nabe. Steve, well, actually, this is a question for both of you, but let me start with Steve. Recently, Japanese officials have suggested Japan would become involved in a war over Taiwan. For example, last June, Japan's deputy defense minister, and actually a year ago, June, he said, we have to protect Taiwan as a democratic country. That's pretty unusual language from a Japanese official, not talking about his own country. Presumably, the Chinese aren't going to make this an easy decision for Tokyo and Washington if they go to war. I doubt they're going to attack US bases in Okinawa at the outset of war, which would make it a very easy decision for the United States and Japan to intervene. And maybe they try and limit destruction instead to Taiwan and present an attack as a fait accompli. Will Tokyo and Washington really get involved in a meaningful way that changes the situation? Would Tokyo ever act alone, absent a clear decision to intervene in a China-Taiwan war by Washington? Steve, maybe we could start with you as sort of, you've spent time in Taiwan, Mandarin speaker, you learned Mandarin there, you're a missionary there, you've done business there, sort of seen both sides of this equation from the US view. So maybe we could start with you.
Well, thank you. I do think that the Japan-Taiwan relationship is one of the underappreciated variables in a potential crisis in the Taiwan Strait. I think it has changed somewhat over time. I would say it's changed in a direction that is favorable to American interests and favorable to the U.S.-Japan alliance. And I put it in the following way. A lot of people think of the Japanese colonial period as a categorical negative. When I lived in Taiwan in the late 1980s, in rural southern parts of Taiwan, it was not seen as a negative. There were generations of people who were born and raised as Japanese citizens, that Japanese and a local dialect were their first languages, and Mandarin was a second or third language after Chiang Kai-shek's government came from the mainland over to Taiwan. A lot of infrastructure that was very well planned and serves Taiwan well even to today was a legacy of some of that colonial period. And so there is in some ways in Taiwan an outlier of the broader narrative about World War II and the Imperial Japan experience, in that there are pretty significant parts of Taiwan's polity that have very favorable views about their time as part of the Empire of Japan. And they also have firsthand experience with the negative parts of China under Chinese Communist Party rule. And so they aren't as open to the political framing of China as victim and Japan as a scary aggressor as a lot of the rest of the region and the world might be. And so the United Front efforts of the CCP have a harder time on that narrative in that area than they have in some other parts of Asia and the world. Now, what has changed, I think, is the Japanese officials and leaders have been coming and going to Taiwan for a long time. Most members of the Diet have taken trips to Taiwan. A much higher percentage of the Japanese Diet has been to Taiwan multiple times than the percentage of members of the US Congress. A much higher percentage of local governors have been to Taiwan than a percentage of American governors. And there's plenty of good reason for that. Some of it is proximity, but there is a deep cultural and neighborly bond between Japan and Taiwan that is very different than when you think of other areas where China's has revisionist and expansive claims, say down into the South China Sea, Southeast Asia generally. So I think that that's the longer term evolution. Nearer term, we saw from Shinzo Abe himself writing in some international media, but also some other leading Japanese thinkers writing in the international media in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the very apparent failure of institutions at least at the outset of that conflict to deter the invasion, that serious Japanese leaders began saying out loud what they had thought about in private, that Japan can't afford to wait for decisions in New York or Washington or other places, that Japan must have its own independent capabilities to act in its own national interests in real time, immediacy, in a time of crisis. And that would apply toward a Taiwan contingency. Japan does not see Taiwan as a contingency that is emotional or ideological. There's this deep cultural tie, but also a very strategic consideration about sea lines of communications, the safety of airspace, and other kinds of considerations. I don't think that for Japan, it's even a question. It's just about whether it would be in their national interest to help Taiwan defend itself if it were under attack, or to help keep a free and open Indo-Pacific that includes Taiwan in that free and open concept. So I think Japan has been moving in that direction. I think it might be further than leaders are willing to go to say that out loud and enshrine it in some article of the alliance or otherwise. But that's a trend that I think now is very well set. Some may say, well, but an independent Japan or Japan going its own way, that's implicitly a criticism of the reliability of Washington. One can choose to look at it that way and frame it that way, but one can also choose to see it as much more complicating for Beijing. And in some ways, I think very healthy in that a broader swath of Americans are much more likely to stand by Japan, and for that matter, Taiwan, if they see Japan and Taiwan doing all that they can to take care of themselves and to have a fair sharing of that burden and risk. That makes the commitment of the United States much more reliable in a time of crisis, in my estimation. And so I think that that is a very important relationship. It's a very important trend that has changed in ways that are fundamental, and one that I'm sure that Beijing hates very much. And so I think that the wolf warrior diplomacy, the political attacks on Japan and trying to seize on Japan's historical past as a dominant and current issue to drive a wedge between Japan and its neighbors is what Beijing's go-to is going to be. And it's really up to America, Japanese leaders, and those that benefit from a positive Japanese engagement in the region and in this alliance to counter that narrative.
All right. Well, Nabe, same question to you, but with a twist. I'd like to combine it with a question from Paul here at the Center for the National Interest. And basically, Paul is asking, saying we're realists here. And the fact is, Japan has concerns about China, but also has an economy that is next to this economic behemoth, which is China. And as Paul says, how do you assess Shinzo Abe's legacy in dealing with China, given mobilization of regional concern about China's problematic behavior, but also his earlier efforts for improved Sino-Japanese relations, which I gather were economically driven. So on the one hand, you have this necessity and reality, but on the other hand, you have somewhat unprecedented remarks from Japanese officials about the threat of war between China and Taiwan. So what do we make of that?
Very good question and a very difficult question, actually. Combine the two, but I try best to explain legacy of Shinzo Abe. Many people tend to misunderstand Shinzo Abe is a hawkish and ultra-nationalist, especially from left in Japan and left in the US even. I appreciated the former Prime Minister Abe's, he's a hawk. He's a pragmatist and a realistic person. So he's calculated clearly Japan need to increase Japan's own defense capability because that's making a good balance of power and making a region more peace. And the same thing applied to the Abe's consideration of economy. Abe is not fully agreed with the containment of China. Rather, Abe somehow tried to maintain the proper economic relation between Japan and China. So China first didn't like Abe, but Abe's the administration is getting longer. They are trying to approach to Abe because Abe is going to be the more powerful than any other administration. But at the same time, of course, Abe is the realist, is clearly the giving China a strong advantage for some cutting-edge military technology, or somehow the lowering a threshold for the military adventurism. That's the end of Japan's security. So that balance is very important. And tackling to your first very difficult question to the defending Taiwan. The Abe former Prime Minister Abe famously said Taiwan contingency is Japan's contingency. That doesn't mean Japan will defend Taiwan anytime. That's what Abe means is geopolitical, geographic, the very closeness between Taiwan and Japan. Not many Americans don't imagine, just next door, seriously. So if some military contingency happens in Taiwan, Japan cannot avoid to be involved if Japan doesn't want. By the way, same thing may apply the US military in Okinawa. So I think that's unfortunately or fortunately we have in the situation, if contingency happens, we cannot ignore the Taiwan situation. That's not the issue of a political decision, probably the more military reality. So because of this, we really need to prepare to deter such kind of situation. So to deter situation in the past, Japan's liberal and pacifist tend to see okay, if we try to be pacifist, peaceful, and reduce military expenditure, probably not giving a negative signal to neighbor and the region would be peaceful. That was a 20 years, 30 years Japan. And somehow Japan has restrained the investment to military. And what happened? So that somehow resulted in a more increasing Chinese military capability, and sometimes their attitude is very assertive, including Japan's island, Senkaku Islands, Japan enjoyed a very historically Japan's territory, but suddenly China claimed the territorial question and sending law enforcement vessel every day. So now that's very good effect to the waking up Japanese people. So again, considering Taiwan's case and considering Japan's Senkaku case, somehow Japanese are more realistic and pragmatic whenever China intensified their challenging attitude. That is the current situation.
Well, thank you, Nabe. One quick question just about the assassination itself. And a question comes from Andrew Oros of Washington College. I'm going to paraphrase what Mr. Oros asked, but he just observes increasing political violence in the United States. And with the assassin himself, you think of the person who tried to kill Ronald Reagan was just a nut job who was trying to impress Jodie Foster. There wasn't a specific political objective. With the assassination, a lot of the U.S. media said, gee, but Japan has strong gun control laws, and this was surprising to them. I would observe personally that Mexico has strong gun control laws, but what Mexico doesn't have is Japanese culture. It's actually Japanese culture that seems to eschew political violence. As Americans, should we be concerned that there's some transition happening in Japan that will lead to more violent outcomes in the future?
I don't know. It will depend on how Japanese society is transforming. However, so far, Japan enjoyed less gun in the society. And, the unfortunate Abe's assassin is coming from not because Japan is somehow turning to the new violence with gun, but still Japan enjoy the little gun violence. Because of this, clearly patrol of the bodyguarding of Mr. Abe was not seriously preparing for the people who has a gun. Many troubles still caused by the knife. From now on, probably the how to protect the VIP would be changed. But unfortunate phenomena is not caused by the Japanese society's trend for gun. Reality is still the little gun is allowed to. This time, the crazy guy who killed Mr. Abe created his own gun rather than purchasing a gun in Walmart or some market. So Japan's gun control is still tight. So far, I don't think I can predict more violent in the Japanese society.
Steve, for a long time, Japanese diplomats and scholars would say they don't want Japan just to be the junior member of a U.S.-Japan alliance. They wanted to be seen as an equal member. They wanted to step up and do more. Sometimes they were a little vague about what that actually meant. But in our last few minutes here, it seems that there has been a change, or am I wrong? Is Japan still the junior member of this relationship? They've increased defense spending a little, as Nabe has said. They're going to increase it potentially significantly, but we'll have to wait and see. Where do you think they are?
Well, I think that there is an opportunity from here going forward to build on the legacies of previous U.S. presidents and previous Japanese prime ministers. The current Prime Minister of Japan seems to be pretty much in agreement with what the summation of the Abe Normal Nation project has been. But just like Shinzo Abe, he's the leader of a coalition. And I thought Paul Hare's question was on point. When you're a leader of a coalition, you have factions within your majority and within your country that will want engagement, say, with the China market, and then you'll have parts of your coalition that are very, very concerned about those entanglements, and leaders are going to have to balance those equities. But from a Japanese point of view, it sure seems like some form of a consensus has been reached in the wake of these reforms, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in the wake of the seeming ineffectualness of the United Nations to really be a barrier for proliferation risk and the national sovereignty being compromised, that they need to have more of their own capability. Ultimately, I think that is the principle that will invest in a more healthy, balanced alliance. A more capable and independent Japan, in an ironic way, becomes a more reliable and close partner. So at least in my conversations, there is an openness in both political parties in the United States, in executive branch people and congressional people. So I see opportunity that's up to those in policy now and in the future to seize and build upon.
All right, well, we're out of time, unfortunately. It's too bad. We could go on for some time. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us, for your great questions. A special thanks to Nabe Watanabe and Steve Yates for participating in today's discussion. And we hope to see you all again soon at a future Center for the National Interest event. Thanks so much.